Welcome to Voices of Tech and Litigation with your host, Ray Beken. This podcast will broaden your knowledge in the use of technology in business and our everyday world. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, chorusconsulting.net. Now here's the host of Voices of Tech and Litigation, Ray Beken.
Hey, this is Ray Beken with Chorus Consulting. I've got a friend of mine, Steve Page, as my guest today. Steve and I have been in the industry for quite a bit, and Steve has a pretty unique perspective going from the vendor side to the law firm side when it comes to computer forensics e-discovery world. And so I thought he'd be a good person to have on right now with Brown and Rudnick. And Steve, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll jump in.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Good to see you, Ray. My name's Stephen Page. As you alluded, I am a litigation paralegal at Brown Rudnick here in Houston. Prior to becoming a paralegal, I was on the vendor side for about 15 years. I started off when it was all paper in the late 90s, early 2000s, as much as it pains me to say those numbers out loud now. I worked for one of the first national e-discovery companies on site, which begat a lot of the current competitors in the marketplace. A lot of my coworkers at on-site are now C-level people at various vendors around the country. After I left on-site, I worked for a wholesale e-discovery provider. We were kind of the behind-the-scenes processing engine for a lot of vendors around the country. Then I worked briefly for the largest forensics company here in Texas. And then I was lured away by one of my clients to jump the fence and come work in the law firm side. And I should probably mention that I'm also a director here in the Houston ACEDS chapter, and I am first vice president of membership and president-elect of the largest paralegal org in Texas, which is Houston Metropolitan Paralegal Org.
Yeah, I see you.
Mouthful, I know.
Yeah, I see you out and about at a lot of networking events. We both have a serial networking kind of personality, so that's really cool. Well, having jumped the fence, what's surprised you about moving over to the law firm side and dealing with attorneys inside the law firm as opposed to being on the vendor side? What's kind of jumped out to you as the biggest thing from transitioning?
Good question. Respectfully to all the attorneys that I work with and know out in the world, I will say that the thing I was most surprised about was how much actual practical training and education that attorneys receive in law school about e-discovery and the process of conducting, what we would commonly refer to as mass litigation. In their classes, they are taught procedure and they're taught theory. And sometimes, depending on the schools that they go to, they do get some exposure to technology, but predominantly they've never seen a document review platform until they are hired and thrown into the grease. So it just surprises me that given the predominance of doc review in so many different areas of law, not just litigation, but, internal investigations, employment law, even family law, criminal law, you would think that there would be a greater focus on training these people, or these attorneys, to be ready to hit the ground running once they graduate.
Yeah, it seems like we could probably, as on the vendor side, do a better job of reaching out to colleges, reaching out to law schools. I was a guest lecturer a couple of times at U of H. They have a accounting fraud class, and I went in as the forensic guest lecturer. And it's surprising that kids that grew up with computers don't know that side of it. No matter how well versed you are on growing up with technology, just not as versed on it as if you had some real life hands-on training on things like fraud and litigation and the computer forensics and the e-discovery side of things. Well, you mentioned tools. What about the evolution of the tools and the technology in the industry? Speak to what you've seen on the evolution of technology and tools available to us.
Well, as I said in my intro, I'm old enough I started working in lit support when I was in college. So I got my first job at 19, working for Kinko's, which is now FedEx Office. But ironically, my first job predominantly revolved around turning things into PDFs.
Okay.
A big part of the customer service model at Kinko's was to take whatever thing someone brought you in the door and make it a PDF so that the fonts and everything else would print correctly. So ironically, it's kind of come full circle because I just do the same thing on a mass scale now to a degree. But to answer your question, I mean, I remember when it was all copy, label, scan, or copy, label, copy times 5. There was no scanning, no blowbacks, no doc review, other than in very, very, very primitive form and only for the largest cases because it was so cost prohibitive. I want to say the first e-discovery job I ever sold at on-site was in the neighborhood of $2,000 to $3,000 a gigabyte, if I'm not mistaken.
On the technology side.
Yeah. So for anyone listening that thinks, they have sticker shock now, you can imagine what it was like back then. But that was prior to the federal rules being changed. That was back in a time where there was sort of a gentleman's agreement, for lack of a better term, just not to produce digital files to each other just because of the incredible expense involved for each side. So I remember, the first big case I ever ran, it was in iPro full TIFF review. That's all there was. And it got there through very primitive conversion tools or mass scan and code operations to get those metadata fields into the software. And then over time, you had tools like Catalyst and Clearwell, and then ultimately Relativity. And then you had the onset of more DIY processing tools. And then certainly now you have the cloud, and then the introduction of all the various forms of, technology assisted review and elements of AI that we deal with now. The principles are roughly the same. It's still pages and metadata, columns and fields, and tagging, right? It's just done in a different form on a much, much larger scale now. And, it's the rule rather than the exception on your cases.
Right. You talked earlier about you've been in the industry from way back when it was paper, right? And we've probably got war stories going back to that sort of stuff. I'm kind of regressing here, but I remember going to like warehouses with a suit and a tie in 95-degree weather and sun air conditioned and picking up boxes and with roaches in them. Just some of the stuff we used to do, that's a little bit of a war story on my part. Give me some experience.
It's worse for us in particular because we're here in Houston.
Right.
And, the energy industry has a heavy reliance still to this day on paper. There's a lot of well logs and all kinds of things that exist on paper, and maybe they've been scanned. Probably they've been scanned at this point. But when that well changes ownership, those boxes of all that stuff go with them. And
Right.
depending on the terms of the deal, sometimes those digital files are handed over, sometimes they're not. Sometimes the same boxes I scanned 10 years ago, somebody's going to need to scan again for the new owner to, make it, implement successfully with their systems.
Right.
But yeah, I think, we have it worse, and it's lingering more here, just because it's still such a part of the oil and gas industry, unfortunately.
Yeah. Any other war stories you can think of? Any fun anecdotes out there?
Um, yeah, I mean, I didn't say it in my bio, but I guess it's worth mentioning. I here in Houston, I guess I'm most famous because I ran the Enron case, um, which I think Well, I'm not even sure if you know that, Ray, but I assume you do about me. But yeah, I was the project manager, if you will, on the vendor side for the criminal defense of the Enron CEOs, or CEO and president. I'm not sure what their chairman, I guess. So Kinley and Jeff Skilling, almost a 6-month trial and about a 2 to 3 year engagement. Back again when it was very, very rudimentary document databases, full TIFF databases at that. I don't recall specifically the numbers anymore because it's been the better part of 20 years, but let's say 2 billion pages in the database, probably in that, somewhere in that ballpark. I want to say we had around 30,000 trial exhibits,
Yeah.
not documents, but actual exhibits.
Yeah.
30,000. And that was my first real trial that wasn't like a 2-day thing for a client. It was my first, big deal that I had been a part of. And
Education by fire.
yeah, it certainly was. And I regularly worked 2 or 3 days without sleep, nonstop, trying to get my clients and their team ready for trial, and just because of the massive amount of information that was in play. And I remember everything that got printed was times 9. So 9 sets of everything, and we would wheel mountains of boxes into that courthouse every morning, with all the witness sets and exhibit sets or whatever they needed for the day. Outside of that, I've worked on a lot of cases that have made the news, I guess you could say, and a whole bunch of other ones that no one ever heard of, which was part of our job.
Right.
I've been in the business long enough to where, I was doing e-discovery and forensics before a lot of police departments had their own people. So my teams were involved with a lot of criminal cases, and a lot of terrible things that happen on the internet, basically, that no one wants to know about. I've been involved with murders, predominantly with prosecuting them, but I am proud to say that I've worked on teams that have successfully exonerated people based on forensic evidence. And I guess given Chorus's business line, I'll tell you a quick story about one of those. So it was in Beaumont. Forgive me, but I do not remember the gentleman's names. But it was 2 African-American gentlemen that have been charged and convicted of murder, for murdering this teenage drug dealer guy. We were asked by their defense counsel, who was a friend of my boss's, to take a look at some of the evidence because he had just a bad feeling about the way the whole trial had been conducted. And I should mention this defense attorney took over after the conviction, he was asked by the family to come in and take a look. So anyways, long story short, we were able to get our hands on the original phones for these two gentlemen. We were able to pull cell tower data for these two devices. And basically, we proved without a doubt that they did exactly what they said they did in their alibi, which was that they were at this one place. They went to go meet this kid and buy some pot from him or whatever. And then they went back to where they were and they sat around playing cards all night. And that's exactly what the forensics showed,
Right.
that their phones were geolocated to this place and they traveled to where this kid was and traveled right back. And they stayed there. They took calls. They were conducting, internet activity that could all be verified based on the IP addresses and the cell tower data. And unfortunately, they were in jail for, I think, 2.5, 3 years, but we were able to get them out.
Right.
That was pretty cool. You don't see a lot of the personal effects of our work. Like most of what we do is for company A versus company B about some contract or business deal gone sideways or whatever. Like there's rarely humans and their futures on the line. So it makes it a little more gratifying, when you see things like that.
Right. Yeah, that's cool. Those deals where you can exonerate someone that's been wronged forensically kind of validates our career, right? And what we do. It's one of those instances where you can really feel good about what you're doing. We had one where you can do it on the opposite side where people have deleted data and they think it's all gone, and you can go in and forensically recover what's deleted and say, no, here's the key piece of evidence they're trying to hide. And, so it can work the other way on the prosecution side, so, but you want to get to the truth. That's
yeah. I get paid the same, right? I'm not here to take sides. I'm just here to do what I'm asked to do. Right. But yeah, it is nice to see, some sort of effect in the real world, on people, and for good reasons, right? Because what's really scary about that is that the police had everything that we used available to them. They just chose not to look at it, and it makes you wonder how often that happens. And I'm not saying that there was any malicious intent on the course of the police, but I think you certainly have an obligation to rule people in as much as rule them out, right? Or rule them out as much as you do rule them in. And in this case, they weren't trying to rule anybody out. They just, thought they had a pretty airtight case without having to look at, what they would call external factors, I guess. But I said, it makes you wonder, it makes you wonder what would have happened to these two guys if their lawyer didn't know my boss, right?
Right.
So, for those reasons, I do try to volunteer, my time and skills when I can, either through ACEDS or the paralegal org, or I also participate in an org called Project Deliver Fund, which I admittedly haven't participated in a couple of years because I've been at trial a lot. But for those of you out there that might be listening that have skills, Project Deliver Fund is a very cool organization. It's a lot of former military and 3-letter government agency folks that get together to bust mostly sex trafficking people. They target large sporting events, the Super Bowl, the Final Four, things like that. They bring in their little task force. They get on all the, dark corners of the internet where people are soliciting women, and then they try to find those that are being trafficked or held against their will.
Oh, wow. That's a totally new podcast we could dig into.
Actually, you know what? Yes. Now that you are asking me for referrals, that would be a very, very good one. remind me when this is over.
Steve Page #2.
Yeah, no, they would be cool to hear about because, like I said, it's all volunteers. They have reunited a lot of kidnapped and trafficked girls with their families, and it's all being done, and most people aren't even aware that it's happening.
Wow.
And it is crowdsourced, crowdfunded. I think some of the vendors and some of the forensics companies in the business Celebrate, Magnet. People like that, I think they contribute tools and things like that to the team, but everyone's there on their own accord, as a volunteer.
That's cool. I mean, just doing something outside, giving your time.
Yeah. Because again, like most of the stuff we do doesn't affect anybody. Like there's no one walking around that can say like some e-discovery guy saved me, right? But so when you get a chance to do things like that, I think you're professionally obligated to do it.
Yeah, agreed. Well, before we close, you have had a unique opportunity to go from that vendor side and then work over on the law firm side. Give me a perspective of what you think of your transition and of going and jumping the fence, if you will.
I could make the argument for either career. Let's just say that. Certainly on the vendor side, you play a little more golf, eat a little more fancy lunches, depending on what you do on the vendor side. But as a salesman consultant, if you will, that's, I definitely had a lot more of that type of fun. It's a different type of pressure, I would say, being on the vendor side, keeping your pipeline full, keeping your customers happy, trying to stay abreast of the latest and greatest in technology. On the firm side, I like it because I'm in the mix, right? Like I have, my finger on the button for a lot of things that transpire. I got lucky, and I was put onto a very young, very cool team of high stakes attorneys, but that keep it about as pleasant as it can be running a trial docket. It has been a lot more work than I anticipated. Even looking at Enron and seeing the hours those people worked and having an appreciation for what attorneys do, you really don't understand, I don't think, until you're on the inside and you see all the different wheels that are in motion supporting those attorneys and supporting the paralegals. And it really does take a village operating in unison at a very, very high degree of precision and efficiency to be able to do what we do, with a low margin of error and, hopefully happy results in the courtroom.
Yeah, cool.
But no, it's been very satisfying. Like, to be honest with you, when I first left the vendor side, I had the intention of probably jumping back over the fence when my non-compete told, but it's really been satisfying, to be kind of front line. I'm the partner I work with. I'm kind of her right-hand person. I handle everything that the attorneys don't have to mess with or don't want to mess with on our cases. So, the best thing I can say about it is, every day is a surprise, right?
That's cool.
I truly have no idea what I'm going to have to do from one day to the next, before the day is over. And that's the fun part, like I've had jobs that paid a lot of money, but they weren't fun or they weren't interesting or they were monotonous. And I would choose interesting things above pay, within reason,
right,
every day.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, how can people get hold of you?
Well, I'm kind of old, so yeah, LinkedIn's your best way to find me. Stephen Page, just like you see it spelled down there in the corner. I'm I was already married when Instagram and all the other things came out, so I didn't really have a good reason for installing those on my phone. I don't use them enough professionally, so I don't even join.
Right.
Plus, frankly, I'm already a bad LinkedIn and Facebook friend because I don't ever get on and like anything anyway. So just figured I'd minimize the damage. But LinkedIn's always best. All my contact info's on there, so if I can ever assist anyone, out there on the internet with anything, professionally or otherwise, then feel free to hit me up.
All right, cool. Well, I appreciate your time, Steve. This is Ray Beken with Chorus Consulting and Steve Page, paralegal at Brown and Rudnick. I've been had a good time. It was a good chat.
You too. Happy holidays, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.
You've been tuning into Voices of Tech and Litigation with your host, Ray Beken. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, chorusconsulting.net. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.